voy a hablar un poquito en español y luego un poquito en inglés, ¿vale? Soy Beatriz Recio, como ha dicho Catarina, soy presidenta de Mujeres Influyentes de España y estoy muy, muy contenta de estar aquí en este interesantísimo y muy necesario Congreso de las implicaciones éticas en la Cuarta Revolución Industrial, que tan brillantemente ha desarrollado European Lawyers Women in an... ¡Oh! Me estoy liando. Perdona, espera. Que lo tengo aquí. Disculpadme, es que me... European... Ahí lo tenéis. European Women Lawyers Association. Sorry. Bueno, tan brillantemente han desarrollado esta asociación y, por supuesto, Catarina Miller, a quien desde aquí quiero que la aplaudáis. Quiero que pediros un aplauso por el gran esfuerzo que ha hecho y por todo el amor y dedicación que ha puesto en este congreso. Me siento muy honrada también porque voy a presentaros a la última ponente. La última ponente siempre suele ser el broche de oro, así que no tengo duda de que Melissa Fisher va a ser una ponente muy, muy interesante. Ella nos va a hablar de liderazgo colectivo de las mujeres y de storytelling en la era digital. Es una mujer influyente donde las haya, influyente a nivel internacional y, por supuesto, cuando me baje del escenario me voy a dedicar a perseguirla, a ver si consigo convencerla para que entren mujeres influyentes, no de España, sino del mundo. Melissa Fisher is a cultural anthropologist who writes on gender, finance, and feminism. She's currently a visiting scholar at New York University's Institute for Public Knowledge and a distinguished principal research fellow at the Conference Board. Her first book, a co-edited volume, Frontiers of Capital, Ethnographic Reflections on the New Economy, explored the social and cultural landscape of business. Wall Street Women, her second book, examines the first generation of women in finance. And nowadays, she's working on a third book, which explores how new social movements, such as Me Too, are shaping individual careers, organizational life, and policymaking in finance and film. So, Melissa, please continue writing, because the more you write, the more interesting and fascinating it is. Fisher has given numerous keynotes and talks nationally and internationally. Her book on Wall Street Women received over 25 reviews in academic journals. Her research has been profiled by the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, CNBC, and the BBC. And she has written also for publications such as Bloomberg. This spring, Fisher will be joining the faculty of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Prior to that, she was the Lauritz Andersen Professor in Business and Organizational Anthropology at the University of Copenhagen. She has also been a faculty member in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University and the Department of Anthropology at Georgetown University. You understand why I'm reading the curriculum, because it's so impressive. She serves on several boards, including the Women Creating Change Leadership Council at Columbia's University Center for the Study of the Social Difference and the Global Business Anthropology Summit Committee. And finally, she works as a consultant applying anthropological and cultural approaches to business for the past 2 decades. Early on in her career as director of special projects for the National Council for Research on Women, she worked on a Ford Foundation-funded project on leadership and diversity in higher education. And currently, as a U.S. delegate and expert to the Women's 20, she advises on gender and financial, digital, and workplace inclusion. She also works with corporations and nonprofits on developing marketing, branding, and strategic insights. And her most recent projects have been in the entertainment and healthcare industry. She's currently working with the Conference Board on a project on the future of work, which is really disturbing, I guess. I don't know if you feel the same, but I'm looking forward to hearing her. So let's welcome Melissa Fisher. Thank you.
Use the mic. Well, I get the award of being the last speaker tonight, and I'm going to do something really different. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'm really struck here by thinking about what would be important to this group composed mostly of academics and female lawyers, and really thinking about what is the relationship between culture and the law, and culture and making social change, and also thinking about what groups, like the groups here, what can we as women do when we combine different forms of expertise, when we come together from different countries and work across difference. So what I'm going to do is do a very classical anthropological move, which is I start with my field work. My field site is in the United States. It's in New York and DC, so I'll bring you over there. And then I'm going to draw out an argument that I'm making about what I see happening in terms of women's organizational styles, how they create leadership, and take us right back to the beginning of this panel, which was women's storytelling, right, which I think is so compelling and so important, and how we can get visibility to stories about women that are not necessarily visible. And that's where we connect more to the fourth industrial revolution, right, the kinds of technology. So I think I'm mic'd over here, and I'm going to partially read, and just again to start with being in the field. So this past April, a member of the first generation of Wall Street women, whom I've been following for the past 3 decades, invited me to attend a fundraiser organized by the Equal Rights Coalition at the Helen Hayes Theater on Broadway in Manhattan. Now, the event was called What the Constitution Means to Me, a special performance and talkback. And it consisted of a wonderful play, which I recommend you see, by a playwright and actress, Heidi Schreck, along with a panel and an after-party to draw attention to the passing of the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, you may or may not know from the news, but the ERA is a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution that would codify and guarantee equal rights for all American citizens, regardless of sex. And it's been stalled. It hasn't happened. Many people don't actually realize that that has not gone through. The coalition formed a number of years ago and is comprised of about 100 national and local organizations that work with legislators, that work with lawyers and others to get the amendment passed. Now, in follow-up interviews with coalition board members, I learned that Schreck, the playwright, actually worked with the board, members of business, members of law, to actually revise the script that was performed the night for the ERA. In the original script, she tells these amazing stories about her family and the women. But accordingly, the ERA board member said, you have to link the family stories, what happened to the women, and why we need an equal rights amendment. So they worked together hand in hand to revise something on Broadway, and I thought that was really striking. Now, in 2019, feminism has become popular. I remember teaching classes 10, 20 years ago, and no one said. But here, I think largely people had some sense of being feminists. And women are forging, like here, new kinds of organizations, new kinds of coalitions, new kinds of projects. Now, some of these projects, and this may be very American in context, have been actually kind of critiqued. I don't know if anybody has read Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, but if you think about the Lean In argument, right, sometimes people said, well, great, she's talking only about elite white women leaning in. She's not paying sufficient attention to racial issues, social justice, or structures of power and inequality. And in the context of the US and UK work, often the idea is that business women, even women lawyers, elite women don't do a certain kind of feminism that will bring about change. I don't think that's actually the case, and I'm sure I would expect that probably most of you don't. So in this talk, I'm going to draw on field work with the first generation of Wall Street women and some of the organizations and the projects they participate in, including the ERA Coalition, in order to consider transformations in women's organizational identities. Whoops. And this is, by the way, the sold-out invitation. But I want to look at women's organizational identities and leadership practices in relation to several different cultural phenomena. First is, how do we understand how women organize in relation to feminism, in relation to power, and also specifically to technology, right, which is what we've been talking about mostly in the last 2 days. It felt like 2 decades. And I'm interested in, Are women just focusing on advancing women up the corporate ladder, or are there other kinds of feminism happening? And I'm going to call this feminism that I see emerging in the context of the United States, and we can talk about whether we see it here in Europe and elsewhere. I call it collective corporate feminism. It's something I've coined. Now, I'm working on and building on the work of organizational and management scholars on feminism, and then there's another bit of literature on alternative forms of leadership. Now, why do I call this collective corporate feminism? And that's Heidi Schreck and others talking on the stage after the Broadway show. So I see them as a collective. The feminism is collective in that women are forming intentional and unintentional solidarities despite differences in race, industry, and other forms of difference to work together. And I think that you begin to see that in the last 2 days. It's corporate in the sense that many, and not all of the actors, are from business, finance, or entertainment, and can bring business strategies and techniques to actually help and forge certain kinds of feminist projects. And it's feminist in that the overarching goals of the collective is enacting gender and other structures and ending gender and other structures of power and inequality. So I'm going to teach you a little of anthropology for your last bit of the day. The common thread that ties the women's organizations together that I've been researching is what I think is called their turn to public culture. So what is public culture? And you have to understand, anthropologists have been studying culture for a long time. As anthropologists Arjuna Padarai and historian Carol Breckenridge argue, public culture is everything we would think of like media, literary and artistic works, films, plays, and I would add everything like the internet and things and how we're thinking about the fourth revolution, industrial revolution. So here, public culture is not just culture. It's also about the people. It's a zone, it's a space composed of producers of culture, their audiences, and the materials and the methods that they use. It's how we how do we use culture as a kind of tool, as something that we're actually creating. And in my work, this is part of a book you're hearing about, I build on the idea of public culture by focusing my analysis on feminist organizations and the forms of culture that they draw upon and create, namely films, plays, and social media. So what do I see as story work? And we can think about how much we've seen story work here today. The revised script Heidi Schreck and the ERA Coalition board members co-created and Schreck performed is an example of what I'm calling story work. Together, the women constructed a new narrative linking individual women's stories and the injustices they experienced to why we need to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. As such, I think story work can be understood as a form of cultural critique. A critique exposing the harshness of many women's lives in American culture, as well as a way of making audience members think about and potentially act upon their own values and assumptions. And that's important in a world in which a lot of the work that's being done about and talk about women and creating change is in the cultural zone. We need to think about how organizations are using culture. I break down story work into at least 3 dimensions that I've identified, and they're up there on the slide. So maybe you can you can switch to sort of showing the slide as well so that people can see it. I don't know if you can follow me, but I'll bring it over. So the first part is really about strategic alliance making, and I think that's really important to think about. How do we create strategize about working across difference, even if we don't totally agree with one another. So in the context of the US, Republican and Democratic women, right? I mean, we're in a very tumultuous moment, right? So how do we actually create kinds of strategic alliances? That's the first. The second entails the different people working together to bring different perspectives and narratives and stories to the fore. So earlier on, we saw the stories of the women from Africa, right? How do we actually use our power, harness our power, right, to bring invisible stories and people and categories to the fore in working together? And this really involves overcoming silences, thinking about who is being silenced, who is not visible, right? Not just people, but actual stories. So earlier you heard about HIV, right? I mean, these were women who had no voice, right? Thinking about who is marginalized and how we can give voice to some of the issues at stake. And the third is thinking about how we can make these conversations public. How do we bring these conversations and these issues to the public arena through certain kinds of cultural forms, whether it's a play, a performance, or social media? So story work for me has these three dimensions, and it involves women with different experiences and expertise coming together to create new stories and alternative ways of engaging in feminist politics and civic engagement. And increasingly, as I've observed over the last 3 decades, women in contemporary organizations recognize the power of utilizing feminist artistic techniques, something we didn't get a chance to really talk as much about in the last 2 days. Really, how do you use sort of art, live performance, to bring attention to political issues, to legal issues, to making social change? So let me return back very, very briefly to that night that I went to about a couple of months ago and break down how I saw story work being done in the ERA coalition. So as I mentioned, it was an event called What the Constitution Means to Me, a special performance and talkback. And it began with the play by playwright and actress Heidi Schreck, who paid for college by winning constitutional debate competitions across the US in high school. And in the play, it's an amazing play, she recalls her teenage self in order to trace her complicated relationship between the 4 generations of women in her family and the founding document that dictated their rights. And there she is sort of talking up. It's a monologue. And in the play, she enacts the second and the third dimension of gendered organizing, of collective corporate feminist story work. On stage, she makes visible different perspectives and agendas and issues, namely the ERA, right, and amending it, and gives voice to marginalized, often exploited groups who do not have rights under the Constitution. And as I discussed in the beginning of this talk, she worked with the board members of the ERA coalition specifically to link the personal stories of her family to why we need to have the ERA. Now, at the end of the play itself, a young woman of color steps onto the stage and engages in a debate with Heidi. Should we continue to uphold the Constitution or throw it out and start anew? So it's a political conversation. Pocket-sized copies of the Constitution are distributed to every audience member. So imagine you're in a Broadway show and now you have the Constitution in your hand, right? It's a great political tool. And we are asked as audience members to imagine that we will vote at the end of the debate in favor or against the abolition of the Constitution itself, not just the Equal Rights Amendment. The effect is a new kind of feminist activist theater and civic engagement, in effect what I am calling feminist collective corporate story work. And we, the audience, were also invited to continue to participate in a discussion of story work that took place in what was called Talkback between Carol Jenkins, an award-winning writer, producer, and media consultant, now the president and CEO of the ERA Coalition, playwright and actress Heidi Schreck, and Jessica Lenahan, the indigenous woman turned lawyer who Schreck talks about in the play. And Jenkins thought about, very important, about the importance of telling women's stories and what she calls the politics of theater. I just want to give you a sense of what she talked about. She told us there is a particularity to Heidi's stories about the women and the generations of women in her family. When you say to people, let's change the Constitution to ensure equal rights, you need a story like Heidi's. And most women have stories to tell. After all, for example, statistics show that, like Heidi, 1 in 3 have abortions, and she has this moment in the play. Our own research in the ERA coalition shows that 94% of people in the country, in the US, want equality, while 80% at the time did not recognize that we don't have equality for women. We need an ERA in place. So I just want to conclude briefly to just thinking about how does this story about the ERA coalition, about the United States, some were very different, what does it tell us? in a larger kind of context. How can we bring the research to ideas about best practices? Well, it's interesting. Just recently, on November 13th of this year, the House Judiciary Committee approved a resolution to change the deadline for the ERA ratification, which was initially set in the 80s. So there's a movement forward about getting the ERA amended that was not seen, has not been witnessed in decades. And the power of social media, right, if you think about kind of how now how social media harnesses that energy, was palpable in the immediate aftermath of the resolution. News about the resolution appeared and spread like wildfire on Facebook, Twitter, and in blogs and articles, as did the history and story of the ERA. So it went from people not knowing anything, that we didn't have an ERA, to suddenly a flurry of understanding. The ERA Coalition's Facebook and Twitter feed was immediately filled with links to various stories about the resolution. You could see pictures. And Carol Jenkins noted that with the Equal Rights Amendment, we can amend the Constitution and change history books. So although the ERA is yet to be amended, the US is much closer to doing so than ever before in history. To what can we attribute this? Now, it's clear this is a large social movement with political practices, legislation, and so forth, but I think that we should also pay attention as people, as social change agents in the world, to the work of public culture, to the work that theater and activism can play, and how we can bring a public conversation into play, right? So what does it mean for the fourth industrial revolution? What would we do here? Can we imagine? This was mostly revising a script that took place in material space, right? It was in the offices of the ERA Coalition. It was on Broadway stage. What if we took it to a bunch of digital kinds of platforms? The collaboration between ERA Coalition members and Heidi Schreck on the narrative script of what the Constitution means to me, and the participation of audience members later during the show, demonstrates that in the contemporary moment, in some instances, there's no single author of a story, script writer or storyteller of women's stories and messages. So we can begin to envision a kind of collaborative storytelling being implied in the digital world. Today, with the advent of the internet and vast networks of social media, the clear divide between author, reader, performer, audience, stage, seats, screens, and bodies, and leader or led are being blurred and broken down. Each of us can post news and opinions to hundreds or thousands of friends and followers. And we are also able to modify stories. Now, of course, there's a dark side to that, but I'm going to end the conference, or this part of the conference, in a more kind of optimistic kind of note. In the contemporary moment, we have an array of digital tools that have the potential to help us become familiar with women's stories, issues, and challenges that were largely invisible to us in previous eras. What is required, then, is a model or a set of models of women's collective leadership and storytelling that builds on the one used by the ERA Coalition and playwright Heidi Schreck in Material Space. So for me, the next challenge that I put to Hugh in the audience is how can we think about building a platform or series of platforms, some exist, how to build on others, that lends itself to a more networked approach to women's leadership, organizing, and storytelling across not only material but digital space. This entails women working together across their differences in race, in industry, and expertise, to bring visibility to women and their stories throughout the globe, and draw attention to the increasing urgent needs to bring about gender equality to all women. And for the moment, I call this model of innovation collective corporate feminist leadership and storytelling for the digital age. Thank you.
Wow. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Katharina. Melissa, congratulations for your proposal. It's very inspiring.
Good.
And my question is, you are promoting the sorority, especially, and the role models both are topics that we need in this moment to live in, in the fourth revolution, in the industrial revolution. Can you share with us one storytelling which inspired you to share with us some story for a woman who inspired you to...
My own story?
Yeah, please.
Oh, my own story is completely independent, but it will tell you why I became and wrote. I wrote my first book was about the first generation of women on Wall Street. And the reason I did it was I was in PhD in anthropology. I thought I was going to do something completely different, but I was very aware of issues about inequality. And in fact, my grandmother had become a lawyer, went to law school in the 30s at UPenn Law School. And when I was a little kid, she told me about what was it like to be in law school and be wearing high heels, and the boys would laugh at her, click, 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 click of the high heels. So I always somehow that story really resonated with me. She eventually went on to become a marriage counselor and many other things, but I was deeply, deeply affected by what did it mean to be a woman in a very male-dominated space. And so when I decided to do a dissertation that became my book, I went to the very first generation of women who came onto Wall Street, who came of age in the 50s and 60s, mostly the 60s, and I asked them about their experiences. So it's a very personal thing for me. And my work in the ERA Coalition, my field work, continues to follow some of the women who are members of the first generation of women on Wall Street are now members of the ERA Coalition, and they've been very nice to let me come in and attend events and talk to them. So there's a kind of continuity of women and women's stories.
Thank you.
You're welcome.